So in about, I don't know, 40 minutes maybe, I will try to illustrate and motivate why I think, and this is not just my personal belief, I think this is also emergent in much work that's being done on reorienting higher education at the moment towards planetary, societal, sustainability challenges. So I'm not the only one thinking this. There's a lot of work being done. How do we learn to live within ecological boundaries? And how do we do so in a way that we can be happy and not just the privileged few, but the many across the globe. So it has also to do with equity and fairness. And my key concern, which was in the abstract, is that, you know, we have a lot of talent in higher education, and honors programs cultivate and nurture that talent. But the question is not so much, you know, and it's, you know, we need to ask that question, what should these talents be, and what are the capacities, skills, competencies, qualities that we need to be successful in life, but also to what end? Is it not just being successful in life, it's maybe also contributing to the common good. And this is, I think, becoming more and more crucial. In my talk, I'll have three components. First, what is the challenge for humanity in what we now call the Anthropocene? What is the role of capacity building and education? What talent? For what? Opportunities for honors programs and students, and many of these opportunities are already being enacted across the globe, and there have been many examples shared also, I'm sure, during these last 2 days, and maybe there's room for questions at the end. So maybe a year or 2 or 3 ago, while we didn't have COVID, I spent quite a bit of time in audiences who may not have an immediate background in sustainability or ecology or environment, to kind of explain climate change and the urgency of it and the significance of it, and biodiversity collapse as another big crisis that is unfolding at the moment. But nowadays, I don't need to spend much time on this because the people who are listening, they already know. So that you might call that as progress, because there's awareness of these nested crises happening at the moment. And as we are struggling with COVID across the globe, you know, we also realize that, yes, we do need to have sanitation and washing our hands and have the proper behavior to cope with the immediate threat of the virus. But we also need to look at the bigger picture. And this has not been emphasized so much yet, in part because we are in a crisis. But what we really need to be doing is also asking the question, you know, how do these viruses arise? Where do they come from? And how are they connected to our lifestyles and maybe loss of habitat, or the way we have intensive agriculture? There are these deeper systemic questions that we need to be asking about how do these crises become more compounded? And how is it possible that one single species, the Homo sapiens, can in less than maybe 150 years alter major Earth systems that have been formed over 3 billion of years? That suggests that we as a species have unique capacities and talents. If you can do that, then there's a tremendous force that humanity has on the planet. And the question, as Mark already said, is how can we utilize that same talent, that same capacity, that knowledge, and maybe that wisdom that exists to restore and heal the Earth? And I think this is a duty that we all have as planetary citizens, and especially people who have the privileged position to enjoy higher education. So what is this challenge? Kate Raworth has introduced this model of the donut economy. Some of you will be familiar with it. Hopefully those who are studying in the world of business and economics are also becoming familiar with this alternative model of the economy, more regenerative, distributive economies. But she is saying we need to learn to live within the ecological ceiling, respecting planetary boundaries that have to do with the ozone layer, the climate change, air pollution, the way we deal with acid rain, nitrogen and phosphates, all these cycles, these natural cycles have integrity, and we need to preserve that integrity. If we overstep it, things might spiral out of control, as is already happening in some of these systems. And the other question is then, how do we do so while maintaining a high quality of life? Good health, good education, a voice, a political voice, gender equality, peace and justice. This is the foundation for a quality life. So we need to have a strong social foundation, but at the same time learn to live within this ecological ceiling. And she calls this the safe and just space for humanity. And most of us are now also talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And here you see them, kind of spread across the donut. Some are more on the outskirts and some are more at the center, like quality education and reduced inequalities you might put at the heart of the social foundation, whereas life on land and biodiversity, life below water, climate action, they're kind of more on the outside. But the key, I think, and this is also a key message today, is that all these goals and challenges are interwoven, they're connected. You can maybe separate them in conversation, but in reality, you cannot. They are always entangled. And part of sustainability education and learning, which is my field, is to develop the capacity in society to see connections, interdependencies, and relationships. So this may not be easily seen, but what you see here basically is a graphic where on the vertical axis you see the ecological footprint, which is kind of the resource space that we use up by living on the planet. And on the horizontal axis, you see the Human Development Index, where you might see the Human Development Index as the social foundation, and the ecological footprint you might kind of see as the planetary boundaries. And then you can see here that there are some countries that have a very high Human Development Index, like Australia and Singapore, for instance, and then also places in the Middle East, like Qatar, Dubai. Although there's inequalities within those countries, we should not forget that. But they also have very high ecological footprints. And then there are, and then you see mostly yellow on the right side, which is Europe and North America, and then Oceania. And on the left side, you see the blue-green dots. Those are sub-Saharan African countries. Very relatively low Human Development Index, although within those countries there's a minority that has a very high Human Development Index, but they have, not by choice per se, but they have low ecological footprints. So you see two kinds of challenges here that are critical. How can the countries that have high ecological footprints and a high Human Development Index maintain a high human development while lowering their ecological footprint? And on the left side, the challenge is different. They want to improve their Human Development Index while not expanding their ecological footprints too much. And then you end up in that kind of sweet spot, you might say, that is in that square towards the right, where some countries you find that have a very acceptable, maybe even high Human Development Index, but also a low ecological footprint. Countries like Costa Rica, for instance, fit in that box. So this is a challenge for education. How do we find that sweet spot, and how do we remain in that donut? The problem with sustainability challenges is that there are no clear answers often about what is then the most sustainable or the most equitable or the healthiest way of living. These are inevitably confusing in a way, and they're sometimes called wicked problems. Here you see a question, and I'm not going to do a poll here, but we could check with you how you would feel about this statement: organic food is also sustainable food. And you would probably find some of you who would agree with that, and some of you who would maybe disagree with that. And this is true for many sustainability-oriented questions. Are energy efficient light bulbs more sustainable than the conventional ones? Again, it may sound like a simple question, but when you really dive into it, it's often not so simple as it seems. Some would say, here's an article saying why organic food is more sustainable, some research done. in the UK. And here on the right side, another article that's saying organic farming isn't all that sustainable, a study says. So there is this ill-definedness, confusion, and different perspectives, diverse perspectives, which need to all be interrogated and investigated, of course. And that is a critical investigations of what then is sustainable or the most sustainable, given what we know today. While we might find out new things, learn new things, and discover that what we think is sustainable today may turn out to be not so sustainable tomorrow. This is what you call the iterative nature of coming to understand sustainability. We'll never reach an ultimate sustainable society simply because we won't be old enough to find out. But we must have a kind of a moral duty to be looking for it all the time. And this is what I will talk about later when I talk about the moral compass that guides us in our work, in our careers. We need to reflect on that. It gets more complicated when there are forces in society that cultivate doubt about what is going on, just because they have an interest in not transforming or transitioning, but maintaining the current status quo. And for instance, after the COVID pandemic, going back to business as usual, whereas some would argue we need COVID as a lever to go to a new future that is based on different morals, different principles than the old status quo. So here's an example of climate myths, and climate denial can be fed by social media. That create confusion and doubt, which can keep people from changing, because they might think, well, until there's no certainty, 100% certainty in science and society, I'm not going to change my behavior. When they know, then I'll change. And the problem is we'll never know for sure. So if that is kind of the mentality, things won't change. And this is important to understand, I think, in how change happens. Here's a cartoon from the New Yorker, which also is illustrative for the era that we live in. Sadly, you might say that often facts don't matter anymore, and science is often put into question, and governance as well. There's very low trust in science in some countries, not all over the world, and also low trust in government. So then you could ask the question, who then has the authority of truth? Whose voices are heard? And as you can see here, it's not always the ones who have the facts or have done the research. Sometimes it's the one who has the most access to social media, who has the most followers, or can shout the loudest, as is the case in this cartoon. And this complicates our transition towards a more fair, equitable, healthy, just, sustainable world. And this is also a telling cartoon. People tend to go for comforting lies rather than unpleasant truths, because it can lead to a feeling of doom and gloom, as was said in the introduction. And people don't like to be reminded of the dire state our planet is in. If that's repeated all the time, it can numb you. It can make you feel powerless. It can make you feel overwhelmed. And it can even lead to anxiety. So people turn rather to comforting lies than to unpleasant truths. This makes the challenge for us as educators even bigger. We must becoming aware of this is one step to dealing with this. You probably have heard of the Netflix Social Dilemma documentary, which shows how the technology that is often used in communication and information sharing, that also our students rely on and we ourselves rely on, can connect us, but it can also control us. In some ways we are entangled, maybe enstrangled, I don't think it's a word, but we are much strangled by the technology, and we need to, as I sometimes say, we need to really connect with each other, but also with the places where we live, and the local environment that supports us. We need to disconnect from the technologies in order to be able to connect to the things that do matter, but we tend to ignore. And I don't want to go into a long lecture about how ICT can lead to forms of narcissism where people are completely preoccupied with themselves, self-development, self-profiling, working on their image all the time, more worried about what others think about them than really about what they're actually doing. And this is also a risk in higher education and also in honors programs where there might be, and this is something to discuss, a tendency to be very much working on your own talents and your own basically working, I'm maybe not saying it in the right way, but working on your CV to make yourself more marketable in the global marketplace. And technology is a continuous distraction in a way. And some people say we are in a perpetual state of distraction where we don't have time to pay attention and to really spend time with people or with places, because the technology is always calling. And there are even scientists also went to good schools, like at Stanford. Sound engineers came up with the WhatsApp sound, the ting sound, which wants you to go back to your phone and to check, and the vibration in your pocket. It's very pervasive and makes it hard to pay attention to the bigger questions. And there's also a tendency of what you might call simplification. And I think what is really critical in today's world is that we don't simplify matters, but we complicate matters. And that's all. I will get to that in a minute. This is about how attention span is shrinking, and I won't get into this, but this is a trend in society that it's difficult also for young people to just be bored on the couch and do nothing, because there's always something calling. The technology is always there. Reading a book has become very difficult for many people today. And these wicked sustainability problems, they require focus, they require attention, and not distraction. So, and as E.O. Wilson says, we have this information everywhere, but the wisdom that we need to deal with these problems is missing. And where do we develop the wisdom that is now needed to learn to live within planetary boundaries in a fair and equitable way? And in part, it is a result of the globalizing economy, where people, water, air, soil are increasingly commodified as something that can be controlled, can be managed, can be measured as input, throughput, output. And we see this in higher education too, where students have become clients, and where their input, throughput, output, and the financing depends on the output. And this leads to a culture of accountability, and not a culture of what we call reflexivity, or a culture of learning. Many school teachers and university teachers do not have the freedom anymore to teach in an open and free way, where there's also focus on the non-measurable, the social-emotional outcomes of learning. They're kind of neglected, and only the things that can be measured count. While the things that often count it cannot be measured. And this is something we need to be thinking about. Has education become an extension of the globalizing economy? In many cases, it has. And preparing for the world of work and lifelong learning for having a job and participating in this economy as somebody who generates income that can be spent 24/7 online or offline to make the economy grow has become an autonomous goal in itself. And this is problematic, because we have planetary boundaries and we cannot grow infinitely. And this rat race is one that we need to be mindful of and be questioning. I'll skip this one for time's sake. And here's an example of how education has been reframed in a way as something that is to serve the economy. This is from a UNECE document on 21st century skills. where it's about education and competitiveness, our ability to compete as a nation and for states, regions, and communities to attract growth industries and create jobs demands a fresh approach to public education. We need to recognize that the 21st century education is the bedrock of competitiveness, the engine, not simply an input, the engine of the economy. So here this is quite clear. And the economy too, it's like the planet and people need to serve the economy, whereas the economy needs to serve people and planet. Things have completely been flipped. And so we need to really think about what is the purpose of education, what kind of qualities, capacities, competencies do we need to develop in society in order to keep this planet to become a dying planet, or to keep it from continuing on this trajectory. And this cartoon kind of illustrates this point very well. Now, if we look at higher education, we too are preoccupied with things like rankings. This is an old Times higher education ranking from a few years ago. I think the numbers have shifted a little bit. I put this one in because it has Wageningen and Rotterdam are in there and Amsterdam. And sometimes these universities flip a little bit. But these rankings depend on how much money is generated from often private money, third money streams, we call it here. How much internationalization do we have in our universities? How many publications do our staff produce? So these are all, and how is the education evaluated? And it's all done through metrics, and the metrics are in a way driving what's happening in the institutions. And this can be highly problematic because, and this is also true for high schools and primary schools across the world that are working on PISA and trying to compete with each other in the rankings, and it's damaging education worldwide. Also, the OECD is beginning to recognize this, and they've tried to optimize the PISA content by also including topics around sustainability. But then you might ask yourself, is that optimizing an unsustainable system? Is it like rearranging the furniture of the Titanic? Or should we just rethink that whole system and maybe move towards more localized curricula that also pay attention to more forms of embodied learning, socio-emotional learning, and not just the measurable, testable outcomes. A final comment before I move to education is that another emerging theme is this of environmental melancholia or eco-anxiety, even ecorexia, where people are becoming, especially young people, are becoming more and more concerned about the future of the planet and their own possibilities for having a family, for instance, because they feel that these problems are becoming so manifest and so big that it's things that are out of control, and they do not feel they have any control over their future being anymore. So they feel disempowered and get depressed, and this anxiety can be paralyzing. So higher education needs to also acknowledge that these emotions and these feelings are strong and rising, and how can we help students develop more hopeful and more generative futures? I think futures literacy has a lot to do with this. Mark, I can probably talk more about this. So, and Renée Lertzman wrote this wonderful book, Environmental Melancholia, where she says, by listening more deeply and focusing on invitation versus persuasion and fear-based appeals, we can build deeper coalitions and collaborations that cross political and ideological boundaries. And so bridging and bonding are seen as critical in creating a healthier society. And well, this is just this is again illustrative for the focus on money, on shareholder value, shareholder equity, company growth, consumer confidence. This kind of language, even calling us people, humans, consumers. You might wonder why. That's kind of dehumanizing to label people as consumers, as if their only role in society is to buy things. which is kind of, we should also question and language sometimes. Fortunately, I should say, young people are rising, and I think we recognize the resistance, different movements around the world, the climate strikes, the Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, and often these movements start in universities, and they did in the past as well. And I find this hopeful, and often faculty and staff, they connect to these movements. Some are hesitant to do this, but there is a kind of resistance emerging. Young people like Greta Thunberg are of course almost a symbol for youth activism, where they're saying we don't want empty words of people like me giving talks and lectures, or politicians doing that, or the heads of government calling, or UN people in the UN calling for action, but not really doing something about it. And instead, they are calling for a kind of maybe a transgressive learning, we call it, going against the grain, being counter-hegemonic, making the ordinary less ordinary, the common less common, guerrilla gardening, finding public spaces and beautifying them, planting seeds, calling attention to injustice, and so on. And this is where I think we need to also, as honor programs, we need to really think about what is our role as people active in higher education, some of the smartest people on earth, you might say, or at least, in the sense that they have, there are many smart people on earth who never go to school, and they learn to live in the very difficult circumstances that I would not survive in. So that certainly requires skills and capacity and wisdom as well. So, but we are the ones who have maybe been the fortune to go to school and to go to university. How do we use that opportunity is a big question. And George Monbiot from The Guardian, he kind of questions how we use our higher education capacities. He says, while we marvel at NASA's discoveries, we destroy our irreplaceable natural resources so we can buy pre-peeled bananas and smartphones for dogs. In other words, are we utilizing this capacity in a good way? What are we strengthening with what we learn in society, and what are we maybe keeping silent or weakening? And that's a very important question, because unwillingly we have a lot of our brain power being used up and utilized by interests and companies that do not have people and planet in mind, but have wealth accumulation in mind, or some other objective that is not helping learning to live within boundaries. So what is education for? I think we always need to be asking this question, and every now and then go back to it. Gert Biesta, Dutch pedagogue, education researcher, philosopher, he distinguishes three goals. Socialization has to do with what is worthwhile in society that we feel needs to be handed over. And these are that could be the common good, or solidarity, or it could be an ethic of care. But it could also be striving for excellence. It could also be becoming competitive, things like that. Individual development can be very important for certain social contexts. So this socialization is a big part of education. It's the ethos that we create in our schools and universities that in a way reproduce something that society has developed over time and finds important. And this can be different across cultural contexts, but there is a tendency of colonization of socialization, in that Western ideas have been in a way eroding some socialization mechanisms that were in place in other parts of the world that were far more solidarity, community oriented. Then there is qualification, which has to do with the skills, the trainable skills, the qualities that we find important in people. For instance, when it comes to sustainability, systems thinking, or anticipatory thinking, or dealing with complexity, or being able to change perspectives. Those are kind of qualifications, or simply understanding photosynthesis, or the Newton's laws. How to learn. That has to do with qualification. And subjectification may be critical, but that's the one that's mostly ignored. It has to do with your own becoming. Who am I? Who do I want to become? Am I able to become who I want to become? Or are forces nudging me in another direction that I'm not even aware of sometimes? And who do I want to be in the bigger world around me? And that subjectification task is often neglected in education, and it's very critical for sustainability and sustainable development. So that also includes the question, what does the earth ask from me? Which is a question that we don't often ask. We often ask, what does society ask from me? Or what does the world of work ask from me? But we should also ask the question, what was the earth? What does the planet ask from me? Thomas Björkman, a Swedish colleague, he talks about different inner societal transformation is a key concept he uses, and he talks about these different components that we need to develop. Complexity awareness, awareness of context, of place, the local entanglement that we have around us and that we're embedded in, that nurtures certain ways of living, certain lifestyles, certain ways of being. Relational awareness, seeing connections, how you are connected to, for instance, the food that you eat is connected with places far away. Compassion and empathy is critical for sustainability. So these are some qualities that we don't pay a lot of attention to in education that need to become more to the fore. And he talks then also, he translates these into transformative skills of being open, perspective seeking, sense making, developing an inner compass to navigate myself and the world with insight based on what is really important to me, and have the courage and the willingness to act on this, and compassion, to show compassion to others, and having a kind of a caring and humble and caring attitude to invite contact. Which is also important, especially in a very competitive world where people are very much preoccupied with self-development, often at the expense of others, because people are often competing. Even colleagues and students, friends are competing for the best internship position or the best project, or and this culture of competitiveness is in some ways amplifying unsustainability. So these are transformative skills are very much needed to move towards living within this donut, you might say. Here's an example of a course that I teach in Wageningen. It's called Environmental Education for Sustainable Living. And one thing that we do in the course is to create space for social-emotional learning and journal writing, reflection. They need to do two reflections where they kind of reflect not so much on what I learned, but how did the course affect me? What did it invoke in me? And Linda Dobson here writes about, and this is with her permission, I'm sharing it. We also encourage to use arts in doing so. Some people use the spoken word, some people use a rap, some people use theater. So we use arts-based approaches to help stimulate reflection, and you get this is an engineering university, Wageningen, and I'm always struck by the creativity and sensitivity that comes out of these reflections. So this is a reflection in week two, where we talk about connecting with place, connecting to nature, understanding nature, and having affect with nature. And in week 4, it's more about sustainability in more urban settings. Here's her reflection. She calls it sickness of the West. And again, she uses materials, but very different materials. And she's suffocated in plastic, and he finds it really hard to live for just 1 week without plastic. And these are very transformative types of activities that we need to have more of in schools and universities. So there are 5 key areas for this type of learning and capacity building. And I think many honors programs will recognize this. So this may not be new, but they need attention. One is understanding change and complexity and transitions. The second one is boundary crossing, systems thinking, and connectivism. The third is building agency, empowerment, and giving possibilities to shape, to influence, to co-design, and transformative capacity, you might call that. Utilizing diversity, uncertainty, not as something that you need to always push away, but that you need to learn to live with. And sometimes you need to invite surprise. To come up with new insights, or to break rituals or routines that are so common that you don't take them for granted and don't see how problematic they might be. And dissonance is a key driver of change and learning. So we need to also cultivate dissonance all the time. And the last one has to do with values, ethics, and moral dilemmas. And we tend to move away from this as if it doesn't have a place in education. But this normative dimension is always there. When we don't talk about it, then we silently accept that, for instance, our schools and universities have become an extension of the neoliberal agenda, focusing on growth, self-development, individualism, competition. That's also normative. That is preparing for the economy. That's a choice. So when people tell me, well, this is very normative, this sustainability focus, and I say, well, how about the unsustainability focus? That's also normative. And in some ways, when people say, oh, we don't have, and sometimes I hear this in schools, we don't have time for sustainability because we have a full curriculum, there are lots of demands, we're very busy. Then I always say, well, actually, it's impossible not to deal with sustainability. All the decisions that we make, everything that we do has consequences for the donut. The way we connect to each other has to do with our social relationship, the way we deal with conflict, the way we deal with diversity. We're always the way we deal with the light in the building, what we eat in the school canteen, the way we use energy, where that energy comes from, the biodiversity on the school ground or the university campus. Somebody is planting, somebody is designing, and it all has impact on sustainability. So you cannot say we don't have time for sustainability. We're immersed in it. We're often not aware of it. So the question is not how do we put it into the curriculum, it's more how do we get it out and give it more attention. So I'm going to wrap up soon now. This picture I was kind of telling, I think over time we've gotten very good at categorizing and reducing the world into boxes and disciplines and things like that. But what we need now is understanding relationships, connections, and thinking the world whole again. And I think young children are already born with that capacity. They don't see the world in disciplines or boxes or categories. They see the world holistically as it unfolds in front of them. But the more time they spend in schools, the harder it becomes in a way. So we are actually losing some qualities that we do have. So how can we bring back this more relational way of being in the world and more relational way of knowing? And there are very simple ways of doing this. Here's an example from the Wageningen CDI management. It's the module on multi-stakeholder processes, where this example is used of one bag of tea. just asking questions about this bag of tea, which, you can imagine. I think I usually have a bag of tea with me here. I don't have one right now, but it has usually a little cord, it has a little carton, it has a staple, it has a bag, sometimes nylon, and then the tea inside. If you would kind of untangle that bag of tea and you look at these components and you look at, okay, what's in it, where does it come from? What kind of chain does it follow? How is that bag of tea used? The water that you boil, what happens to it after you drink it, also with your urine. And you start looking at the whole bag of tea from a systems perspective. What are the inputs, the throughputs, the outputs? Then you can make connections with the whole sustainability puzzle is in this one bag of tea, if you're willing to look for the connections. And these are the kind, I call these SDGs the low-hanging fruit, because the link to climate is easily made. The link to clean energy is easily made. Good health and well-being, that link is easily made, and so on. It becomes a little bit trickier when you try to make the connection to, for instance, gender equality. What is the connection with gender and this bag of tea? Well, if you go into the chain and you go to the tea farmers and the smallholder farmers perhaps, and you look at women in the chain and the conditions under which women work in the chain and whether they get paid equal, if there's equal pay in the chain between men and women, then you already start seeing gender connections. So, and this is when I talk about SDGs, I think it's very important, not so much what SDG connects to this. The question should always be, how does each and every SDG connect to this? Because there's always a connection. And if you can't see the connection, then that's what you need to focus on. And these are important capacities that we need to develop. We could also take, I was just thinking, we could put a mask in the middle and ask these kinds of questions. Or you see them all over the place. I'm not sure where you are, but here in Holland, I do jogging, I run every now and then, and I see many masks everywhere. And of course, these are not healthy products either. Lots of not biodegradable materials. And under what conditions were they made? They're so cheap, these masks nowadays. We should critically investigate these masks from a sustainability point of view as well. And it would open up lots of conversations about sustainability. Okay, to end, I do think that our universities and our colleges are becoming far better at boundary crossing, far better at utilizing the local environment as a source for learning, far better at letting students ask the questions and giving them a voice in selecting topics and choosing topics. Especially in honors programs, you see that the shift of the teaching and learning is moving away from the professor or the instructors towards more self-determined, autonomous learning driven by existential questions that matter, that students are concerned about, that they're interested in. And I also see, and living labs is one example of this new emerging phenomenon that is becoming more popular. But you also see, this is from the Utrecht University, not the university, the Hogeschool Utrecht, Utrecht University of Applied Sciences. They also have their international business program working on the SDGs. So you see also honors programs working more with sustainability as a focus. This one is from University of Amsterdam. I just looked at some Dutch examples. Wageningen students work on many of these honors projects that they work on in teams. Here's one team. They focus on sustainability-oriented questions. Here's one on responsible travel. Lots of students travel all over the world, and not just students, lots of staff as well, which is not very sustainable. But how can we create more sustainable, more localized tourism? How can we make that more attractive, more feasible, more appealing? So they created this online journal, The Green Grasshopper, which loads of ideas of how to do this. And on the left is a student that I, as a mentored. I'm also in the Wageningen honors program called a mentor. So I have one or two students in every cohort, and I really enjoy doing that mentoring. So to wrap up, just like there cannot be business as usual, there cannot be education as usual. I think we need to, we have a window of maybe 20, 30 years of transitioning to a world that is greener, that is fairer, that is more equitable, and ultimately more sustainable. higher education has a pivotal role to play, as there is a lot of capacity, a lot of talent that can help us in this transition. At the moment, you see already niches all over the world, in the global north, but also in the global south, with localized food, localization of power, peer-to-peer exchange, new forms of social innovation. And in all these spheres, you see innovation towards a more sustainable world. And a key question is, how can schools and universities and honor programs connect to these niches and movements? How can they strengthen them? That, I think, is an important question. And also for honor students who graduate to reflect on, when I choose a job, when I pick a career, how can I, from within that organization, contribute to this? Or how can I tweak, influence, nudge my organization to create a culture or an ethos that is more grounded in place, more grounded in local community, more mindful of the consequences of the business far away, more focused on not just adding economic value, but also adding social value and ecological value. So to create a more sustainable company, I think honor students will be leading in leading positions. Oftentimes they can utilize their influence and their capacities to do this. So to close, some suggestions. I think it's important to ask yourself, and this is true for students, but also for staff, I suppose, how can my talents become a driving force for creating a more sustainable world? Or maybe put differently, what is it that my talents are currently sustaining in the world, making possible in the world, strengthening in the world? And am I okay with that? Because sometimes we don't even realize that we have become part of a system that in itself is unsustainable. And we might be optimizing something that needs to, in the end, be replaced by something else. Second, consider sustainability not as a destination that we will once arrive and then we can sit back and relax, but see it as a quest for a better world for all, a continuous learning process, and a lifelong mission that need not be depressing. I think it is not all zoom and gloom or doom and gloom. Zoom and gloom is what we are into lately. But so there are these pockets of innovations where there's lots of energy, lots of creativity, and that show that living lightly on the planet in a fair and a healthy way is possible. Third, contemplate your career and professional development in light of global challenges at hand. I think that one is obvious. Seek diversity and multiple perspectives. Look for synergy, but also for conflict and contestation. There's no change without conflict, also without inner conflict, that nagging voice of unease that is kind of questioning what you are doing, that you are trying to keep silent. But that you need to listen to sometimes. And finally, resist the culture of fear by fostering, engaging in hopeful action. I think that is very important. If we only focus on the awareness and the complexity of these issues, it will lead to apathy, powerlessness, and inaction. Therefore, we need to also create space for action, space for designing, space for regenerating. And I have seen honor students do that type of work already and being inspiring for others as well. So with that, I would say thank you for your time, and hopefully I've opened up some questions that you may have. Maybe there's something in the chat. I cannot see it. There's, you can also send me an email. It's in the lower left, or go to my blog, transformativelearning.nl, where I sometimes post articles or other resources that you may find interesting.